Wednesday mornings in Cedar Falls have their own rhythm. The coffee shops buzz with pre-work energy, delivery trucks rumble down elm-lined streets, and somewhere between the chaos of modern life, people like me show up with toolboxes to fix the things that break. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I've been running Thompson Home Services for 8 years now. Nothing glamorous, fence repairs, deck installations, the occasional bathroom renovation that turns into a 3-week odyssey of discovering previous homeowners' creative interpretations of building codes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That particular Wednesday started like any other. I was parked outside a colonial-style house on Sycamore Street, sipping lukewarm coffee from a gas station cup and mentally preparing for what the work order described as a stubborn garden gate that won't latch properly. Simple enough. Garden gates are usually a 30-minute fix. Realign the hinges, adjust the latch, maybe replace a rusty bolt or two. Easy money, straightforward work, the kind of job that lets you feel accomplished without breaking a sweat. The house itself caught my attention before I even rang the doorbell. Someone had put real thought into the landscaping. Hostas lined the walkway in perfect symmetry, their broad leaves creating natural borders between sections of carefully maintained flower beds. Purple clematis climbed a wooden trellis near the front porch, and hanging baskets overflowed with trailing petunias in shades of pink and white. This wasn't the work of a weekend warrior with a Home Depot gift card. This was the garden of someone who understood that plants, like people, need patience and attention to thrive. I knocked on the front door, toolbox in one hand, invoice pad in the other. The woman who answered surprised me. Not because she was striking, though she was in that understated way that speaks to confidence rather than vanity, but because she looked like she belonged in her own garden. Her hands showed the telltale signs of someone who worked in soil regularly. Slight stains under her fingernails, the kind of calluses that come from wielding pruning shears and handling rose stems. She wore faded jeans and a green cotton shirt that had seen better days, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had given up trying to contain a few rebellious strands. "You must be Marcus," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm Sarah Montgomery. Thank you for coming out so quickly." Her voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years outdoors, speaking over lawnmowers and leaf blowers, directing landscaping crews and explaining plant care to curious neighbors. There was something immediately disarming about her directness. No small talk about the weather, no apologies for bothering me with such a minor repair, just straightforward communication from someone who valued efficiency. "No problem at all," I replied, following her through a living room that managed to feel both comfortable and elegant. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with gardening manuals, plant identification guides, and what looked like a collection of mystery novels. A large window overlooked the backyard, where I could see raised garden beds arranged in neat rows, each one labeled with small wooden signs that were too far away to read. "The gate's giving me trouble," Sarah explained as we walked toward the back door. "It's been getting worse over the past few weeks. Sometimes it latches fine, other times it hangs open no matter what I do. I've tried everything I can think of, but I'm better with plants than I am with hardware." We stepped onto a brick patio that extended from the house toward the garden area. The backyard was even more impressive than the front, a masterpiece of organized growing spaces that somehow managed to look both productive and beautiful. Tomato plants climbed tall cages in one section, their branches heavy with fruit in various stages of ripeness. Herb gardens created fragrant borders between vegetable rows, and a small greenhouse sat in the far corner, its glass panels reflecting the morning sun. The garden gate stood at the entrance to this horticultural paradise, connecting two sections of wooden fence that separated the main yard from the growing area. It was a simple design, cedar planks held together with cross braces, hung on sturdy hinges that had seen better days. But as I approached, I could see the problem immediately. The gate had settled over time, probably due to the fence posts, shifting slightly in the soil. What should have been a clean, straight line now hung at a subtle angle, causing the latch mechanism to miss its target by just enough to be frustrating. "I see the issue," I said, running my hand along the bottom edge of the gate. "The whole thing's dropped about half an inch. Happens more often than you'd think, especially with older fence installations. The posts settle, the gate follows, and suddenly nothing lines up properly. Sarah nodded, watching as I opened and closed the gate several times to confirm my diagnosis. I was worried it might be something complicated. This garden means everything to me. I can't have rabbits and deer treating it like an all-you-can-eat buffet. How long have you been gardening? I asked, genuinely curious. The level of organization and care evident in her setup spoke to years of experience and genuine passion. About 15 years seriously, she replied, her eyes scanning the garden. Beds with the satisfaction of someone surveying a job well done. Started as a hobby when my ex-husband and I bought this place. Turned into something much bigger after he moved out. Gardening became my therapy, my exercise, my creative outlet. Pretty much everything except my income, though I've been thinking about changing that. There was a story there, I could tell. The way she mentioned her ex-husband so matter-of-factly, without bitterness or lingering hurt, suggested someone who'd processed that chapter of her life and moved on. The garden itself felt like evidence of that progression, too well-established and thoughtfully designed to have been created in the immediate aftermath of a divorce, but too personal and intimate to have been a joint project. I knelt beside the gate, examining the hinges more closely. These are good quality hinges, I noted. Someone knew what they were doing when they installed this originally. The problem's not with the hardware, it's just physics. Soil shifts, posts move, and even the best installations need adjustments over time. Can you fix it? Sarah asked, crouching down beside me. Up close, I noticed she smelled faintly of lavender and something earthier. Maybe the potting soil that was probably a permanent fixture under her fingernails. Absolutely, I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my knees. I'll need to adjust the hinges, maybe add some shims to level everything out. Should have you back to keeping the wildlife out of your vegetables within the hour. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she seemed to relax slightly. Would you like some coffee while you work? I made a fresh pot this morning, and it's actually good coffee, not the gas station stuff you're probably used to. I glanced at my half-empty cup sitting on the patio table. How did you know this was gas station coffee? Lucky guess, she said with a slight grin. Plus, I saw you drinking it when you pulled up. I may spend most of my time talking to plants, but I still notice things. The offer of coffee felt like more than simple hospitality. There was something in her tone that suggested she wouldn't mind the company while I worked, even if that company was just a contractor with dirt on his boots and a toolbox full of solutions to problems she couldn't solve herself. I'd appreciate that, I said. But let me get started on this gate first. I like to tackle the actual problem before I get too comfortable. Sarah nodded approvingly. A man with priorities. I like that. As she headed back toward the house, I opened my toolbox and pulled out the tools I'd need for the job. The gate repair itself was straightforward. Remove the bottom hinge, add a thin wooden shim to raise that corner, reinstall everything with slightly longer screws to ensure a solid connection. But something about the situation felt different from my usual service calls. Maybe it was the obvious care Sarah had put into her property, or the way she'd spoken about gardening as more than just a hobby. Whatever it was, I found myself taking extra time to ensure the repair would be perfect, not just functional. The hinges came off easily, revealing wear patterns that told the story of thousands of openings and closings. This wasn't a gate that got used occasionally. It was part of someone's daily routine, opened and closed multiple times as Sarah tended to her various garden beds. I selected a shim that would lift the bottom corner just enough to restore proper alignment, then test-fitted it before making the final installation. Sarah returned with 2 mugs of coffee just as I was tightening the last screw. Perfect timing, she said, setting one mug on a nearby garden table. How's it looking? I swung the gate open and closed several times, testing the latch mechanism. The alignment was perfect now. The latch engaged smoothly and held securely. Good as new, I said, accepting the coffee mug gratefully. Actually, better than new. The original installation was solid, but this should hold up even better now that I've made the adjustments. The coffee was excellent, rich and smooth, with none of the bitter aftertaste that usually comes from sitting too long on a warming plate. Sarah had been right about the quality difference. This is great coffee, I said, taking another sip. Where's it from? Local roaster downtown, Sarah replied, leaning against the fence and watching as I packed my tools. I discovered them about a year ago when I was exploring the farmer's market. The owner's wife grows herbs that complement different coffee blends, lavender, mint, even some edible flowers. It's become my Saturday morning ritual to stop by their booth and try whatever new combinations they've come up with. The farmers market. I should have guessed. Sarah struck me as the type of person who would know every vendor by name, who'd built relationships with local growers and small business owners. There was something appealing about that level of community connection, especially in a world where most people grabbed coffee from whatever chain was most convenient. I should check that out, I said. I go through enough coffee to make it worth finding a good source. You should, Sarah agreed. It's every Saturday morning in the park downtown. Great selection of local produce, artisan goods, usually some live music. Very different from the grocery store experience. As I closed my toolbox and prepared to leave, Sarah walked over to the gate and tested the latch herself. The mechanism engaged perfectly, holding firm when she gave it a gentle tug. It's perfect, she said, genuine relief evident in her voice. I can't tell you how frustrating it's been, trying to keep this thing closed. You'd think after 15 years of gardening, I'd have figured out basic gate maintenance. Different skill sets, I said. I can fix a gate, but I'd probably kill every plant in your garden within a week. We all have our areas of expertise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah laughed. You'd be surprised how forgiving plants can be. Most of them want to grow. You just have to avoid getting in their way too much. There was wisdom in that observation that extended beyond gardening, though I didn't say so out loud. Instead, I handed her the invoice and watched as she reviewed the charges without the usual customer routine of questioning every line item. This seems very reasonable, she said, pulling out her checkbook. Most contractors I've dealt with would have found a way to turn this into a much bigger job. It was a simple fix, I replied. No point in making it complicated, Sarah wrote out the check, then paused before tearing it from the book. Can I ask you something, Marcus? Sure. Do you do other kinds of outdoor work? Beyond repairs, I mean. Like construction projects or landscape improvements? I nodded. Depends on the project. I've built decks, garden structures, retaining walls. What did you have in mind? Sarah glanced toward the far corner of her yard, where a section of chain link fence separated her property from her neighbors. I've been thinking about replacing that fence with something more attractive. Maybe cedar privacy panels that would match the garden aesthetic better. And I've been considering adding a pergola over the patio area. Something that would provide partial shade, but still let enough light through for the plants I want to grow underneath. These were the kinds of projects I enjoyed. Substantial, enough to be interesting, but not so complex that they'd drag on for months. And working for someone who clearly cared about quality and attention to detail made the prospect even more appealing. I'd be happy to take a look and put together some estimates, I said. Projects like that are right in my wheelhouse. Would you have time to discuss it now? Sarah asked. I know you probably have other appointments, but I'd love to get your initial thoughts while you're here. I glanced at my watch. My next appointment wasn't until after lunch, and there was something about Sarah's enthusiasm for her outdoor space that made me want to help her realize whatever vision she had in mind. I've got some time, I said. Show me what you're thinking. Sarah's face lit up as she led me toward the corner of the yard where the chain-link fence stood. As we walked, she explained her ideas with the kind of detail that comes from months of planning and consideration. She wanted the pergola position to provide afternoon shade for a seating area, but angled to avoid blocking morning sun from reaching the garden beds. The fence replacement would need to be tall enough for privacy, but designed to complement the existing garden structures. I've been sketching ideas, she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her back pocket. I'm not much of an artist, but maybe this will give you a sense of what I'm envisioning. The sketch was actually quite good. Not professional architectural drawing quality, but clear enough to show that Sarah had thought through the practical aspects of both projects. She'd considered sightlines, measured distances, even noted the path of the sun throughout the day and how it would affect plant placement. This is excellent planning, I said, studying the drawing. You've clearly put a lot of thought into how everything would work together. I've had plenty of time to think about it, Sarah replied. Living alone gives you lots of quiet evenings to plan projects you may never actually tackle. There was something wistful in that comment, a hint of loneliness that she'd covered with humor. I found myself wondering about her story. How long she'd been divorced, whether she had family nearby, what her social life looked like beyond gardening and farmers markets. "Well," I said, "looks like you're ready to move from planning to building. The pergola design is definitely doable, and the fence replacement is straightforward. I could have material estimates for you by the end of the week if you're serious about moving forward." Sarah nodded. "I'm serious. I've been putting off major improvements for too long, telling myself I should wait until I'm sure I'm staying here long term. But the truth is, this is my home. I should make it the space I want it to be, regardless of what the future holds." That statement carried weight beyond home improvement decisions. It sounded like someone who'd reached a turning point, who'd decided to invest in her own happiness, rather than waiting for external circumstances to provide certainty. "I think that's a smart approach," I said. "And from what I can see, you've created something really special here. These improvements would just be the finishing touches on a space that's already pretty remarkable." Sarah looked around her garden with obvious pride. "It's been a labor of love, literally. After my marriage ended, I threw myself into this garden, like my life depended on it. Some days, I think it actually did." The honesty of that admission surprised me. Most clients kept conversations superficial, focused on project details and timelines. But Sarah seemed comfortable sharing something more personal, as if the garden gate repair had somehow established a level of trust that went beyond typical contractor-client relationships. "Gardens have a way of teaching patience," I said. "And persistence. Probably good therapy for anyone going through major life changes." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Plants don't care about your relationship status or your career disappointments or whether you're living the life you thought you'd be living at 50. They just need consistent care and attention. There's something reassuring about that kind of simplicity." 50. So we were probably close to the same age, though Sarah carried her years with the kind of grace that comes from staying physically active and emotionally engaged with life. There were laugh lines around her eyes and a slight weathering to her skin that spoke to hours spent outdoors, but nothing about her suggested someone who'd given up on adventure or possibility. "I should probably let you get to your next appointment," Sarah said, though she didn't sound particularly eager to end the conversation. "Actually," I said, "would you mind if I took a few more measurements? If I'm going to put together accurate estimates, I want to make sure I have all the dimensions right." It wasn't entirely necessary. I could have returned later with a measuring tape. But something about the morning felt unfinished. Sarah had shared more about herself than most clients ever did, and I found myself curious to learn more about her story, her plans, the life she was building in this carefully tended corner of Cedar Falls. "Of course," Sarah said. "Take all the measurements you need. I'll be weeding the herb garden if you need anything." As I measured fence lines and calculated pergola dimensions, I found myself glancing toward the herb garden where Sarah worked, with the focused attention of someone who genuinely enjoyed physical labor. She moved efficiently between plants, pulling weeds with quick, practiced motions, and occasionally pausing to examine a leaf or flower more closely. There was something meditative about watching her work, a reminder that not all meaningful labor happened with power tools and construction materials. When I finished measuring, I walked over to where Sarah was working. She'd filled a small bucket with weeds and was now deadheading spent flowers from a large rosemary bush. "All done with measurements," I said. "I should have those estimates ready by Friday if that works for you." Sarah stood up, brushing soil from her knees. "Perfect. Would you like me to call you, or would you prefer to drop them off?" "I could stop by Friday afternoon if you'll be around," I said. "That way we can go over the details in person, make sure I understood your vision correctly." "I'll be here," Sarah said. "I work from home most days now, so my schedule is pretty flexible." "What kind of work do you do?" I asked, realizing I'd been curious about that since she'd mentioned thinking about turning gardening into income. "Freelance graphic design," Sarah replied. "Mostly marketing materials for small businesses, some web design work. It's not the most exciting career, but it pays the bills and gives me the freedom to spend time on what I really love, which is, obviously, gardening. Among other things," Sarah said with a slight smile. "I've been thinking about starting a plant consulting business, helping people design and maintain their own gardens. There's more demand for that kind of service than you might think, especially among people who want beautiful outdoor spaces, but don't have the time or knowledge to create them. It was a smart business idea, especially for someone with Sarah's obvious expertise and genuine passion for the subject. And it would allow her to combine her design background with her gardening knowledge in a way that could be both fulfilling and profitable. That sounds like a natural fit, I said. Have you taken any steps toward making it happen? Just preliminary research so far, Sarah admitted. I've been hesitant to make major changes when I'm still figuring out this whole starting over at 50 thing. But recently I've been thinking that maybe it's exactly the right time for something completely different. There was that theme again. The idea of reinvention, of embracing change, rather than simply enduring it. Sarah seemed to be at one of those pivotal moments when people either retreat into familiar routines or take bold steps towards something new and uncertain. Well, I said, from what I can see, you've definitely got the skills and knowledge to make it work, and you've got a pretty impressive portfolio right here in your backyard. Sarah looked around her garden again, as if seeing it through a potential client's eyes. I suppose I do. Maybe it's time to stop thinking about it and start actually doing something about it. As I walked back toward my truck, I found myself thinking about the morning's conversation. Sarah Montgomery was clearly someone who'd been through significant life changes and had emerged stronger and more focused. Her garden was evidence of that transformation, a space that reflected careful planning, consistent effort, and genuine joy in the process of creation. But there was something else about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way she'd talked about living alone, or her comment about quiet evenings spent planning projects. Despite her obvious competence and self-reliance, there was a subtle loneliness that she wore like a well-fitted jacket, present but not obvious unless you were paying attention. I loaded my tools into the truck and took one last look at the garden gate, now hanging perfectly straight and latching securely. It was a small fix, but it would make Sarah's daily routine just a little bit easier. And somehow, that felt more significant than most of the repairs I completed. As I drove toward my next appointment, I realized I was already looking forward to Friday afternoon and the conversation about pergolas and privacy fences. It had been a long time since a routine service call had developed into something that felt like the beginning of a longer story. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of golden light that makes everything look like a photograph waiting to happen. I'd spent the morning at a kitchen renovation in the suburbs, wrestling with cabinets that had apparently been installed by someone who believed measuring twice was for amateurs. By the time I pulled into Sarah's driveway, I was ready for the straightforward conversation about pergolas and fence panels. What I wasn't ready for was the sight of Sarah Montgomery covered in mud from her ankles to her elbows, standing in what appeared to be a crater where her prize-winning tomato bed used to be. "Please tell me you're not here to witness my complete gardening breakdown," she called out, brushing a dirt-streaked strand of hair away from her face with the back of her wrist. I grabbed my estimate folder and walked over to survey the damage. "What happened here?" "Sprinkler system malfunction," Sarah said, gesturing toward a section of PVC pipe that was sticking out of the ground at an odd angle. "Apparently, when you ignore a small leak for 3 weeks, it eventually becomes a large leak that turns your vegetable garden into a mud wrestling arena." The scene was impressive in its destruction. Water had undermined the soil beneath her carefully constructed raised beds, causing one entire section to collapse into a soggy mess. Tomato plants that had been thriving just days ago now lay at awkward angles, their root systems partially exposed and their leaves wilting in the afternoon heat. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, noting the extent of the water damage. "I discovered it this morning around 6, Sarah replied. "I came out to check on the garden before my coffee and found this swamp where my tomatoes used to be. I managed to turn off the water, but the damage was already done." She looked exhausted, and not just from the physical work of trying to salvage what she could. There was something defeated in her posture that hadn't been there on Wednesday, as if this gardening disaster had struck at something deeper than just her carefully tended plants. "Have you called a plumber?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "I called 3 different companies. The earliest anyone can come out is Monday afternoon. Meanwhile, I'm watching 15 years of soil preparation turn into a muddy disaster zone." Knelt down and examined the broken pipe more closely. The fitting had clearly been leaking for some time, gradually washing away the soil around it until the pressure finally caused a complete failure. It was the kind of problem that could have been avoided with regular maintenance, but Sarah was a gardener, not a plumber. "I can fix this," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my hands. "You do plumbing work too?" Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice. Basic stuff like this, yes. I'm not licensed for major installations, but a sprinkler repair is well within my wheelhouse. I'd need to run to the hardware store for parts, but I could have this fixed by this evening. Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. Marcus, I can't tell you how much that would mean to me. This garden is... She paused, looking around at the muddy chaos. Well, it's pretty much everything I have. The emotional weight of that statement hit me harder than I'd expected. Sarah hadn't just been upset about damaged plants. She'd been watching her primary source of joy and accomplishment literally wash away. Let me take care of the plumbing first, I said. Then we can figure out how to salvage the garden beds. Most of those plants are probably tougher than they look right now. Sarah nodded, but I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I'm sorry you're seeing me like this, she said. I'm usually much more put together. You're dealing with a crisis, I replied. Nobody's put together during a crisis. That's what makes it a crisis. The practical response seemed to help her regain some composure. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at the damage with more determination than despair. What can I do to help? She asked. Show me where the main water shutoff valve is, and then maybe put on some coffee while I run to get parts. This is going to take a few hours, and I have a feeling we're both going to need caffeine. While Sarah went to clean up and start coffee, I walked the perimeter of the damaged area, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need to be completely rebuilt. The situation was bad, but not hopeless. The raised bed frames were mostly intact, and while the soil had been displaced, it hadn't actually gone anywhere. It had just redistributed itself in inconvenient ways. The hardware store trip took longer than expected, mainly because I wanted to get the right parts the first time rather than making multiple trips. I picked up new pipe fittings, a section of PVC to replace the damaged portion, and some additional supplies that would help with the garden restoration. On impulse, I also grabbed a bag of high-quality potting soil and some plant food that might help the traumatized vegetables recover. When I returned to Sarah's house, I found her sitting on the patio with 2 mugs of coffee, looking much cleaner, but still emotionally drained. She'd changed into a fresh shirt and pulled her hair back, but there was a fragility about her that hadn't been there during our first meeting. Feeling better? I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Marginally, Sarah replied. I keep telling myself it's just a garden, but that's not really true. This place has been my sanctuary for so long that seeing it destroyed feels like losing a piece of myself. I understood that feeling better than I could explain. After my divorce, I'd thrown myself into work with the same intensity that Sarah had apparently invested in her garden. The idea of watching years of careful effort wash away in a single morning was genuinely heartbreaking. It's not destroyed, I said. It's damaged, but not destroyed. Most of these plants have root systems that are stronger than they appear. And soil is soil. It can be moved back where it belongs. Sarah managed a small smile. You're very optimistic. For someone who just volunteered to spend his Friday evening playing in the mud. I've had worse ways to spend an evening, I replied, which was true enough. The plumbing repair took about 2 hours, including the time spent carefully excavating around the damaged pipe without disturbing the surrounding plants any more than necessary. Sarah proved to be an excellent assistant, anticipating what tools I'd need and asking intelligent questions about the repair process. How did you learn to do all this? She asked while I was fitting the new pipe section into place. Trial and error mostly, I said. Started helping my dad with projects when I was a kid, then learned more complicated stuff when I bought my first house. Turns out there's a lot of overlap between different types of repair work: plumbing, electrical, carpentry. Once you understand the basic principles, it's just a matter of adapting them to specific situations. I wish I had that kind of practical knowledge, Sarah said. I can keep plants alive, but anything involving tools or mechanical systems is completely foreign to me. Different skill sets, I reminded her. I can fix a sprinkler system, but I couldn't create anything like this garden if my life depended on it. Once the plumbing was repaired and tested, we turned our attention to the garden restoration. This was where Sarah's expertise became evident. She could look at a damaged plant and immediately assess its chances of survival, knowing which roots could be buried deeper and which stems needed to be trimmed to encourage new growth. Working together, we managed to salvage about 70% of the affected plants. The tomatoes were the biggest challenge. They'd been nearly ready for harvest, and the sudden transplant shock had wilted their leaves dramatically. But Sarah assured me that tomato plants were surprisingly resilient, and with proper care, most of them would recover. The secret is not to panic, she explained, gently repositioning a plant that had been knocked sideways by the water damage. Plants can handle a lot of stress if you don't compound it by making drastic changes. Give them time to adjust, keep them watered but not soaked, and most of them will figure out how to keep growing. Sounds like good advice for people too, I said without thinking. Sarah paused in her work and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Yes, she said quietly. It really does. By the time we finished the emergency repairs, the sun was setting and we were both exhausted. The garden looked better than it had that morning, but it would take weeks of careful attention to fully restore what had been damaged. I can't thank you enough, Sarah said as we surveyed our work. When I saw this mess this morning, I honestly thought about just giving up, starting over somewhere else, maybe getting a condo with a balcony and a few potted plants. I'm glad you didn't, I replied. This place is too special to abandon over one bad day. Sarah nodded, but I could see she was struggling with something. Can I ask you something, Marcus? Sure. Do you think there's an age when it becomes foolish to start over? When should you just accept that what you have is what you're going to have? The question caught me off guard with its directness and its underlying vulnerability. Sarah was clearly wrestling with something much larger than garden repairs. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think giving up on the possibility of something better is probably more foolish than trying and failing. Even at 50? Especially at 50, I said. At 50, you've got enough experience to know what you really want, and hopefully, enough wisdom to pursue it effectively. Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd arrived that afternoon. You know, I was so focused on the garden disaster that I forgot you were coming over to discuss the pergola and fence projects. We can talk about that another time, I said. Today was about crisis management. Actually, Sarah said, I'd like to talk about it now. After everything that happened today, I'm more convinced than ever that I want to invest in making this place exactly what I want it to be. We spent the next hour going over my estimates and discussing the details of both projects. Sarah had clearly done her homework. She'd researched materials, looked at design options online, and even checked with the city about permit requirements. Her questions were thoughtful and specific, showing that she'd moved beyond the daydreaming phase into serious planning. The pergola is the priority, she said, studying my sketches. I want to create a space where I can sit outside in the evenings, without feeling like I'm on display for the neighbors. Privacy is important, I agreed, especially when you're trying to create a peaceful sanctuary. Exactly. And I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not giving up on the possibility of something better. This garden renovation isn't just about plants. It's about creating a space where I can entertain friends, maybe even host small events related to that plant consulting business I mentioned. The excitement in her voice was infectious. Sarah wasn't just recovering from the day's disaster, she was using it as motivation to move forward with plans she'd been postponing. When would you want to start? I asked. As soon as possible, Sarah replied. I've been putting off major decisions for too long, waiting for the perfect time or the right circumstances. But perfect circumstances don't exist, do they? Sometimes, you just have to create them. We shook hands on the projects, and I promised to have a timeline and contract ready by the middle of the following week. As I packed up my tools, I realized that the day had evolved into something much more significant than a simple plumbing repair. Marcus, Sarah said as I was loading my truck, would you be interested in staying for dinner? It's the least I can do after you rescued my garden. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to stay, but because I sensed that accepting the invitation would shift our relationship into territory that went beyond contractor and client. I make a mean pasta primavera, Sarah added with a smile. And I promise the vegetables are from the undamaged section of the garden. How can I refuse an offer like that? I said, closing the tailgate of my truck. Dinner turned out to be one of the most enjoyable evenings I'd had in months. Sarah was an excellent cook, and the pasta primavera was everything she'd promised. Fresh vegetables prepared simply, with herbs that had been growing in her garden just hours earlier. We ate on the patio, surrounded by the sounds of evening, settling over the neighborhood. The conversation flowed as naturally as it had during our first meeting. but with an added layer of intimacy that came from having weathered a crisis together. Sarah told me about her marriage, her divorce, and the difficult process of rebuilding her life as a single woman in her 40s. I found myself sharing stories about my own failed relationship, my struggles with starting a business, and the loneliness that sometimes came with being self-employed. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made different choices?" Sarah asked as we finished the wine she'd opened to celebrate the garden's salvation. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I've learned that wondering about alternate histories is usually less productive than focusing on what comes next." "That's very wise," Sarah said. "I spent the first year after my divorce playing the what-if game constantly. What if I'd been more understanding? What if we'd tried counseling sooner? What if I'd been willing to compromise more?" "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That some relationships run their course, and fighting that reality just prolongs the unhappiness. My ex-husband wasn't a bad person, but we'd grown into people who wanted different things from life. Staying married would have been unfair to both of us." The honesty of that assessment impressed me. Sarah had clearly done the difficult work of processing her divorce without becoming bitter or closed off to future possibilities. "It sounds like you've made peace with it," I said. "Mostly," Sarah replied. "Though I'll admit, there are moments when the idea of starting over feels overwhelming. Dating at 50 is terrifying in ways I never expected." The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to address directly. But something had shifted during the evening. We'd moved from polite professional interaction to genuine personal connection. As I prepared to leave, Sarah walked me to my truck, her bare feet silent on the driveway. The garden gate stood perfectly aligned in the background, a reminder of how our acquaintance had begun just a few days earlier. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. The plumbing, the garden rescue, the company. Today could have been a complete disaster, but somehow it turned into something much better." "Thank you for dinner," I replied, "and for trusting me with your garden emergency." We stood there for a moment, two people who'd started the day as contractor and client and were ending it as something approaching friends. The evening air was warm and still, filled with the scent of Sarah's recovering garden and the distant sound of a neighbor's television. "I'll call you next week about the pergola timeline," I said finally. "I'll be here," Sarah replied, assuming no more sprinkler disasters. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about Sarah's question regarding starting over at 50. The evening had demonstrated that she was clearly capable of adapting to unexpected challenges, of finding opportunity within crisis. But there had been something wistful in her voice when she'd mentioned the terror of dating again, as if she'd resigned herself to the idea that romantic companionship was a chapter of her life that had already ended. I understood that feeling. At 48, I'd fallen into a similar assumption about my own romantic prospects. Work had become my primary focus, and the idea of opening myself up to the vulnerability that came with dating had seemed more exhausting than appealing. But something about the evening with Sarah had reminded me that meaningful connections could develop in unexpected ways, growing out of shared experiences and genuine compatibility, rather than the artificial constructs of dating apps and set-up scenarios. The thought stayed with me as I fell asleep that night, along with the image of Sarah's smile when she'd realized that her garden could be saved. There had been something beautiful about watching her move from despair to determination in the space of a single afternoon, and I found myself looking forward to being part of whatever came next in her story of reinvention. The following Tuesday, morning brought with it the kind of unseasonable heat that makes even the most experienced contractors question their career choices. I was 3 hours into framing Sarah's pergola when my phone rang, interrupting what had been a surprisingly peaceful morning of measuring, cutting, and methodical construction. "Thompson Home Services," I answered, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear while holding a 2x8 in place. "Marcus, it's Sarah. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just installing your pergola," I said, securing the beam with a temporary clamp. "What's going on?" "I have a situation," Sarah said, and I could hear stress in her voice. "My sister Rebecca is driving up from Portland this afternoon with her husband and their 2 teenagers. Apparently, they've decided to make an impromptu visit to check on how I'm doing with my life transition, as Rebecca likes to call it." I set down my hammer and gave Sarah my full attention. "That sounds complicated." "It is. Rebecca means well. but she has very strong opinions about how I should be living my life. She thinks I'm wasting my potential by hiding out in my garden, and she's been pushing me to move closer to Portland where she can keep an eye on me. The family dynamics were becoming clearer. Sarah had mentioned her sister before, but only in passing. Now it sounded like Rebecca was one of those well-meaning relatives who confused involvement with support. "How can I help?" I asked. "This is going to sound strange, but would you be willing to join us for dinner tonight? Rebecca is expecting to find me isolated and possibly depressed, living like a hermit with only my plants for company. If she sees that I have friends, that I'm building connections here, maybe she'll back off from her relocation campaign." The request was unusual, but I could hear the genuine anxiety in Sarah's voice. Family pressure was something I understood. My own mother had spent years suggesting that I move back to my hometown where she could help me find a nice girl and settle down properly. "What time?" I asked. 6:30. "And Marcus?" "Thank you. I know this is asking a lot." "It's not asking too much," I said. "What should I know about Rebecca and her family before I meet them?" Rebecca is 3 years older than me and has never been subtle about thinking she knows what's best for everyone. Her husband Tom is actually lovely, quiet, smart, and has learned to navigate Rebecca's strong personality. The teenagers are typical teenagers, but basically good kids. Just be yourself. Don't let Rebecca intimidate you with her questions. After hanging up, I returned to the pergola construction with renewed focus. The physical work of cutting lumber and assembling joints provided a good counterpoint to thinking about the evening ahead. Sarah's request had revealed something important about her current situation. She was dealing with family pressure on top of everything else she was navigating. The pergola was taking shape nicely. Sarah had chosen a design that would provide afternoon shade while maintaining the open feel of her patio space. The structure was substantial enough to support climbing vines eventually, but clean-lined enough to complement the existing garden architecture. It was the kind of project that would improve both the functionality and beauty of her outdoor space. Around noon, Sarah appeared with a pitcher of ice water and a plate of sandwiches. She looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen before, her usual confident demeanor replaced by the slightly frantic energy of someone preparing for a challenging family visit. "How's it going?" she asked, surveying the partially completed structure. "Right on schedule," I said, accepting the water gratefully. "This should be finished by tomorrow afternoon." "It looks exactly like I imagined," Sarah said, walking around the pergola and examining the joints. "Maybe even better." We sat in the shade of her existing patio umbrella, eating sandwiches and discussing the final details of the construction. But I could tell Sarah's mind was elsewhere, probably running through possible scenarios for the evening's dinner. "You're worried about tonight," I observed. Sarah nodded. "Rebecca has this way of making me feel like I'm failing at life, even when things are going well. She thinks I should be dating actively, pursuing a more ambitious career, living in a bigger city. The idea that I'm happy with my garden and my quiet life doesn't compute for her. Some people can't understand that happiness doesn't always look the same way for everyone," I said. "Exactly. But Rebecca sees my contentment as settling for less than I deserve. She means well, but her version of helping can be exhausting." I understood the dynamics Sarah was describing. Some family members confused activity with progress, assuming that a quiet life automatically meant an unfulfilled one. "For what it's worth," I said, "from what I can see, you've built something pretty remarkable here. Not everyone needs to live in a big city to have a meaningful life." Sarah smiled, looking more relaxed than she had all morning. "That's exactly what I needed to hear. Sometimes I question whether I'm being too cautious, too resistant to change." "There's a difference between being cautious and being intentional," I replied. "You're creating a life that fits who you are, not who someone else thinks you should be." The afternoon passed quickly as I focused on the technical aspects of the pergola construction. The work was satisfying in the way that good craftsmanship always is, each joint fitting perfectly, each measurement translating accurately from plan to reality. By 5 o'clock, the structure was nearly complete, with only the final sanding and staining remaining for the next day. I was packing up my tools when a silver SUV pulled into Sarah's driveway. Even from a distance I could see the family resemblance between Sarah and the woman who emerged from the passenger seat. Rebecca was taller than Sarah, with shorter hair and a more corporate appearance, but they shared the same intelligent eyes and determined jawline. "The cavalry has arrived," Sarah said under her breath, walking toward the driveway to greet her family. I watched the reunion from the patio, noting the subtle dynamics at play. Rebecca's hug was enthusiastic but brief, and she immediately began surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone conducting an inspection. Her husband Tom seemed more relaxed, taking his time to appreciate the garden and the partially completed pergola. The teenagers, a boy who looked about 16 and a girl who appeared to be 14, were more interested in their phones than their aunt's landscaping achievements. "Rebecca, Tom, kids," Sarah called out. "I'd like you to meet Marcus Thompson. He's been helping me with some home improvement projects." Rebecca's handshake was firm and assessing. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. I have to say, this pergola is impressive." "Are you a contractor?" "I am," I replied. "Sarah has excellent taste in design. This is going to be a beautiful addition to her outdoor space." "It certainly is," Tom said, walking around the structure and examining the craftsmanship. "This is really well-built work." Rebecca was studying me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "How long have you been working on Sarah's projects?" "Just started this week," I said. "But I fixed her garden gate about 10 days ago, and one thing led to another." "One thing led to another," Rebecca repeated, glancing meaningfully at Sarah. "That's interesting." Sarah jumped in before her sister could pursue that line of questioning further. "Why don't we all go inside and get settled? Dinner won't be ready for another hour, but I thought we could catch up first." The next hour provided an education in family dynamics that I found both fascinating and slightly uncomfortable. Rebecca clearly loved her sister, but her version of love involved a lot of pointed questions about Sarah's social life, financial situation, and long-term plans. She managed to convey concern and criticism simultaneously, creating a conversational atmosphere that kept everyone slightly on edge. "So, Sarah tells me you're thinking about starting a plant consulting business," Rebecca said during a brief lull in her interrogation about Sarah's dating life. "Have you done any market research? Developed a business plan?" "I'm still in the preliminary stages," Sarah replied carefully. "I want to make sure I understand the local market before I make any major commitments." "Market research is important," Rebecca agreed. "But at some point, you have to take action. You can't research yourself into success." Tom caught my eye and gave me a look that suggested he'd witnessed this kind of conversation many times before. The teenagers had long since disappeared to explore the garden, leaving the adults to navigate Rebecca's well-meaning but relentless advice. "Marcus," Rebecca said, turning her attention to me. "What's your take on the local business climate? Do you think there's demand for horticultural consulting services?" It was clearly a test, designed to assess whether I was someone who would encourage Sarah's ambitions or enable what Rebecca saw as procrastination. "I think Sarah has a lot to offer," I said honestly. "She's got extensive knowledge, practical experience, and the kind of problem-solving skills that clients value. The real question isn't whether there's demand, it's whether she's ready to take on the challenges of running her own business." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "That's a very pragmatic perspective. Sarah has always been incredibly capable, but she sometimes needs encouragement to take risks." The comment was clearly directed at Sarah, who was listening to the conversation with the patient expression of someone who'd learned to endure family advice sessions. Dinner was actually more enjoyable than I'd anticipated. Rebecca's intensity softened once she'd satisfied herself that Sarah wasn't completely isolated, and Tom proved to be an engaging conversationalist with interests ranging from woodworking to local history. The teenagers emerged from their phone-induced stupor long enough to ask intelligent questions about the pergola construction and Sarah's garden design. Aunt Sarah, the girl, whose name was Emma, said during dessert, "Why don't you start a YouTube channel about gardening? My friend's mom does one about cooking, and she's got like 50,000 subscribers." Sarah laughed. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of public exposure, Emma." "But you're so good at explaining things," Emma insisted. "You could teach people how to start their own gardens, how to fix problems, all that stuff." Rebecca perked up at this suggestion. "Emma has a point. Social media marketing is crucial for small businesses these days. You could build an audience before you even officially launch your consulting service." "It's worth considering," I said, genuinely intrigued by the idea. "You've got the knowledge and the teaching ability. and your garden would make a great backdrop for instructional videos. Sarah walked me to my truck while her family settled into the guest rooms. The evening air was still warm, filled with the sounds of insects and the distant hum of air conditioning units. "How do you think that went?" Sarah asked. "Better than you were expecting, I think," I said. "Rebecca obviously cares about you, even if her way of showing it can be overwhelming." "She's been like that since we were kids," Sarah said. "Always trying to fix things, always convinced she knows the right answer. But you handled her in turn." Sarah looked thoughtful. "I never considered that approach. It's certainly different from traditional marketing methods." "Different isn't bad," Tom said quietly. "Sometimes different is exactly what you need." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from business strategy to family memories to local politics. By the time we moved to the patio for coffee, Rebecca seemed satisfied that Sarah was building a life that included meaningful connections and future possibilities. "The pergola is going to be perfect out here," Rebecca said, looking up at the partially completed structure. "It'll provide just enough shade without blocking the view of the garden." "That was the goal," Sarah replied. "Marcus helped me design it to complement the existing landscape rather than dominating it." "You two make a good team," Rebecca observed, and there was something in her tone that suggested she was drawing conclusions about our relationship that went beyond contractor and client. As the evening wound down, I found myself oddly reluctant to leave. The family dynamic, while occasionally intense, had been genuinely warm, and I'd enjoyed being included in Sarah's world beyond our usual project-focused interactions. "Thank you for joining us," Rebecca said as I prepared to leave. "It's clear that Sarah has found a good friend in you." "The feeling is mutual," I replied, meaning it more than I'd expected to. "Ogation beautifully." "Was that what that was?" I asked, with a smile. "Oh, absolutely. Rebecca was trying to figure out exactly what kind of friend you are. I think she's concluded that you're a good influence." There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested she was curious about the same question. What kind of friend was I exactly? The evening had blurred some of the lines between professional and personal relationship, and I wasn't entirely sure where we stood. "I should let you get back to your family," I said finally. "Marcus," Sarah said as I opened the truck door. "Thank you for tonight. Having you there made everything easier. Rebecca can be a lot to handle, but with you there, I felt like I had an ally." "Anytime," I said, and realized I meant it completely. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about Emma's suggestion regarding a YouTube channel. It was actually a brilliant idea. Sarah had natural teaching ability, extensive knowledge, and the kind of authentic passion that translated well to video content. More importantly, it would give her a platform to share her expertise while building a potential client base for her consulting business. But what struck me most about the evening was the way Sarah had introduced me to her family. Not as my contractor, or the guy working on my pergola, but simply as Marcus, someone who was helping with projects and had become a friend. The casualness of that introduction suggested that our relationship had evolved beyond its original boundaries, though neither of us had explicitly acknowledged that shift. The thought stayed with me as I fell asleep, along with the image of Sarah's smile when Rebecca had finally approved of the pergola design. There had been something deeply satisfying about being part of Sarah's support system during what could have been a stressful family visit. And Rebecca's parting comment about us making a good team had felt like recognition of something that was becoming increasingly obvious. We did work well together, in ways that extended beyond construction projects and garden repairs. The question was, what did that mean for both of us going forward? The Saturday morning farmers market in downtown Cedar Falls buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes from people genuinely excited about locally grown tomatoes and handcrafted soap. I'd never been much of a farmers market person. My usual Saturday routine involved catching up on paperwork and maybe tackling a home project I'd been postponing. But Sarah had mentioned her weekly ritual of visiting the coffee roaster's booth, and I found myself curious enough to break my usual routine. Spotted her near the herb vendor, engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation about the medicinal properties of calendula. She wore a sundress I hadn't seen before, pale yellow with tiny blue flowers, and had traded her usual ponytail for hair that fell loose around her shoulders. The effect was striking enough that I almost turned around and left, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of showing up unannounced. "Marcus!" Sarah called out, spotting me before I could retreat. "What a wonderful surprise. I didn't know you were a farmer's market person." "I'm not, usually," I admitted, walking over to join her. "But you made that coffee roaster sound pretty compelling." Sarah's smile was genuinely delighted. "Perfect timing. I was just about to head over there. Linda, this is Marcus Thompson, the contractor I was telling you about. Marcus, Linda grows the most amazing herbs in the county." Linda, a woman in her 60s with soil-stained fingers and laugh lines that spoke to decades of outdoor work, shook my hand with surprising strength. "Sarah's been singing your praises. Says you saved her tomato garden and built her a beautiful pergola." "Sarah's easy to work for," I replied. "She knows exactly what she wants and isn't afraid to communicate it clearly." "A rare quality in clients." "I'm sure," Linda said with a knowing smile. "Sarah, dear, don't forget what I told you about the lavender tincture. Start with just a few drops." As we walked away from Linda's booth, Sarah carried a small paper bag that smelled strongly of herbs. "Lavender tincture?" I asked. "For sleep," Sarah said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I've been having trouble shutting my brain off at night. Too many decisions to make, too many possibilities to consider." I understood that feeling. Since starting my own business, I'd struggled with the kind of mental hyperactivity that made sleep elusive. There was always another project to plan, another client to call back, another problem to solve. "Business planning keeping you awake?" I guessed. "Among other things," Sarah said, then seemed to decide on greater honesty. "Rebecca's visit stirred up a lot of thoughts about what I want the next chapter of my life to look like. And Emma's suggestion about the YouTube channel has me completely overthinking every aspect of the idea." We reached the coffee roaster's booth, where a bearded man in his 30s was grinding beans with the focused intensity of someone who took his craft seriously. The aroma was incredible, rich and complex, with hints of chocolate and nuts. "Sarah," the roaster called out. "Perfect timing. I just finished a new blend that I think you'll love. It's got notes of caramel and orange zest." "David, I'd like you to meet Marcus," Sarah said. "Marcus, this is David Chen, the coffee genius I was telling you about." David's handshake was firm and confident. "Any friend of Sarah's is welcome here. What's your usual coffee preference?" "Dark roast, strong enough to wake the dead," I replied. David laughed. "A man after my own heart. Let me set you up with something special." While David prepared our coffee samples, I watched Sarah interact with the other vendors who clearly knew her well. She moved through the market like someone who belonged there, stopping to admire produce, asking knowledgeable questions about growing techniques, and engaging in the kind of conversations that spoke to genuine relationships rather than simple transactions. "She's something special, isn't she?" David said quietly, following my gaze. "She seems to know everyone," I observed. "Sarah's been coming here since the market started 5 years ago. She's helped half the vendors troubleshoot plant problems, and she's never once asked for anything in return. The kind of person who makes a community feel like an actual community." David's coffee was every bit as good as Sarah had promised. We found a spot at one of the picnic tables that had been set up in the shade of mature oak trees, watching the steady stream of market-goers while sipping what might have been the best coffee I'd ever tasted. "This is dangerous," I said, savoring another sip. "I'm going to become one of those coffee snobs who can't drink anything else." "Welcome to my world," Sarah said with a laugh. "I used to be perfectly happy with grocery store coffee. Now I can't even look at it without feeling disappointed." The conversation flowed easily as we people watched and gradually made our way through the market. Sarah introduced me to more vendors than I could keep track of: the organic vegetable grower who supplied restaurants throughout the county, the artisan bread baker who'd moved from Portland specifically to be part of the Cedar Falls food scene, the couple who raised heritage breed chickens and sold eggs that were apparently superior to anything available in stores. "You're like the unofficial ambassador of this place," I said, as we paused at a booth selling handmade wooden bowls. "I love supporting local businesses," Sarah replied. "There's something satisfying about knowing where your food comes from, knowing the people who grew it. It feels more connected than the anonymous grocery store experience." The bowl vendor, an elderly man with calloused hands and kind eyes, overheard our conversation. "Sarah here was one of my first customers when I started selling at the market," he said. Bought a salad bowl set that I was sure was too expensive to move, then brought 3 friends back the next week. Beautiful craftsmanship deserves to be appreciated, Sarah said, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a large serving bowl. And used. What's the point of owning something beautiful if you keep it hidden away? The philosophy seemed to extend beyond bowls and into Sarah's approach to life in general. She'd created a garden that was both functional and beautiful, chosen to support local artisans even when cheaper alternatives were readily available, and was now considering launching a business that would share her knowledge rather than keeping it private. As we walked back toward the parking area, our arms full of market purchases, I found myself thinking about the contrast between Sarah's community connections and my own more solitary approach to life. I had clients, certainly, and professional relationships with suppliers and other contractors. But the kind of genuine personal connections that Sarah had cultivated weren't something I'd prioritized. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, noticing my contemplative mood. "Just thinking about community," I said. "I've been self-employed for 8 years, but I don't think I've built the kind of relationships you have here. Most of my interactions are purely business." Sarah stopped walking and looked at me with genuine interest. "Is that by choice or just how things developed?" "Probably a bit of both," I admitted. "After my divorce, I threw myself into work as a way of avoiding the messiness of personal relationships. Somewhere along the way, that became my default approach to most things." "I understand that impulse," Sarah said. "After my marriage ended, the garden became my safe space. Plants don't judge, they don't have complicated emotional needs, and they respond predictably to care and attention, much simpler than people." "But you didn't stay isolated," I pointed out. "You built all of this." I gestured toward the market, where Sarah was clearly a valued member of an extended community. "It took time," Sarah said, "and it started with the garden. People would walk by and ask questions about my plants, and gradually those conversations developed into friendships. The market was a natural extension of that, a place where people who cared about the same things could connect." We'd reached our vehicles, but neither of us seemed eager to end the morning. Sarah was parked next to my truck, and she leaned against her car door as if settling in for a longer conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Of course. What made you decide to show up here this morning? I mean, I'm glad you did, but it seems like a departure from your usual routine." The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about starting over at 50. You've clearly figured out how to build something meaningful after your divorce. I'm wondering if maybe I've been too narrow in my focus." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's scary, isn't it? Opening yourself up to new possibilities when you've gotten comfortable with a predictable routine." "Terrifying," I agreed. "But also, maybe, necessary." "Well," Sarah said, "if you're interested in expanding your community connections, there's a garden tour next Saturday that I'm participating in. 6 local gardeners open their spaces to the public, and I'll be giving talks about sustainable growing practices. It's not exactly a farmer's market, but it's another way people around here connect over shared interests." The invitation felt significant, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "You want me to come to your garden tour? I'd love to have you there," Sarah said. "You could see what I do when I'm in full teaching mode, and it might give you a sense of whether there's really a market for the consulting business I've been considering." "I'll be there," I said without hesitation. Sarah's smile was radiant. "Wonderful. Fair warning, though, I get pretty passionate. When I'm talking about plants, Rebecca always says I turn into a completely different person when I'm in my element. I'm looking forward to seeing that side of you," I said, and realized I meant it completely. As I drove home from the farmer's market, I found myself thinking about the morning's conversations and what they revealed about the direction my life had taken. Sarah's easy integration into the local community stood in sharp contrast to my own more isolated approach to living and working. But spending time in her world had reminded me of the satisfaction that came from meaningful connections, from being part of something larger than individual concerns and immediate needs. The garden tour invitation felt like an opportunity to see Sarah in her element, to understand the expertise and passion that had impressed everyone from her sister to the farmer's market vendors. But it also felt like a chance to explore what it might mean to be more than just Sarah's contractor, to move into whatever territory lay beyond professional relationships and casual friendship. That afternoon, I found myself cleaning my apartment, with unusual thoroughness, as if preparing for inspection. The place was functional but sparse. Furniture chosen for durability rather than style. Walls bare except for a few photographs of completed projects. It served its purpose as a place to sleep and eat, but it didn't feel like the home of someone who'd learned to appreciate the kind of beauty that Sarah had created in her garden. Sunday morning brought a text from Sarah that made me smile. "Thanks for joining me at the market yesterday. David wants to know if you're interested in trying his new espresso blend. Apparently he's convinced he can convert you into a proper coffee enthusiast." I typed back, "I think the conversion is already well underway. Looking forward to Saturday." The response came quickly. "Me too. Fair warning. I'm planning to put you to work answering questions about the pergola construction. Apparently several people have been asking about adding similar structures to their own gardens. The idea of being part of Sarah's garden tour presentation hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. The pergola was an attractive and functional addition to her outdoor space, and other gardeners would naturally be curious about the construction process. "Happy to help," I texted back. "I'll bring business cards in case anyone wants to discuss their own projects." Sarah's response was immediate. "Perfect. We make a good team." That phrase, "we make a good team," stayed with me for the rest of the day. Rebecca had used similar words during her visit, and both sisters had said it with a tone that suggested they saw more than just professional collaboration. The question was whether Sarah was beginning to see our relationship in the same light that I was starting to recognize in myself. The week that followed was unusually busy, with 3 different clients requiring emergency repairs and a new project. That involved rebuilding a deck that had been damaged in a recent storm. But even with the packed schedule, I found myself thinking about Saturday's garden tour and what it might reveal about Sarah's world and my place in it. Thursday evening brought another text from Sarah. Question: what's your tolerance for crowds? The garden tour typically draws 200-300 people throughout the day, and my yard will be one of the busier stops. Crowds are fine, I replied. Will you be nervous? Terrified came the immediate response. But also excited. This feels like a test of whether I'm ready to put myself out there professionally. You're going to be amazing, I typed back. Anyone who spends 5 minutes listening to you talk about plants will want to hire you immediately. Sarah's response took longer to arrive. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Thank you for believing in me, Marcus. The exchange felt intimate, in a way that went beyond friendship, though neither of us had crossed any explicit lines. We were communicating like people who cared about each other's success and happiness, who'd become invested in each other's stories. The realization was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming. Friday night, I found myself standing in front of my closet, trying to decide what to wear to a garden tour. The question had never come up in my adult life, and I had no idea what was appropriate for an event that was part educational presentation and part social gathering. I settled on khakis and a button-down shirt, professional enough to represent Sarah's work well, but casual enough to avoid looking out of place in a garden setting. As I fell asleep that night, I realized I was more nervous about the garden tour than I'd been about any work presentation in years. The difference was that this time, I wasn't just representing myself and my own professional abilities. I was going to be part of Sarah's world, helping her present her expertise to people who might become clients or colleagues. The responsibility felt significant, but also strangely exciting. Tomorrow would reveal whether our collaboration could extend beyond construction projects into the realm of Sarah's horticultural ambitions. More importantly, it would show whether the connection we'd been building could survive the scrutiny of Sarah's broader community and the pressure of public presentation. For the first time in years, I was genuinely looking forward to finding out what came next. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, gentle breeze, and the kind of golden light that makes every garden look like it belongs in a magazine. I arrived at Sarah's house an hour before the tour was scheduled to begin, carrying a box of business cards and the kind of nervous energy I hadn't experienced since my first job interview. Sarah answered the door wearing a green linen dress that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the color of her eyes. She looked professional but approachable. Exactly the image a potential horticultural consultant would want to project. You look nervous, she said, studying my face with amusement. I am nervous, I admitted. I've never been anyone's business partner before. Is that what we are? Sarah asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested the question carried more weight than its casual delivery implied. Before I could answer, the first tour visitors began arriving. Couples in their 60s carrying notebooks, younger, families with children who immediately gravitated towards Sarah's flower beds, and several people who had the focused intensity of serious gardeners seeking inspiration. Sarah transformed the moment she began speaking to the crowd. Her usual quiet confidence bloomed into something radiant as she explained her composting system, demonstrated proper pruning techniques, and answered questions about soil pH with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a favorite hobby. This pergola was designed by my friend Marcus, she said, gesturing toward where I was standing near the structure we'd built together. He understood that I wanted afternoon shade without blocking the morning sun that my vegetables need. The casual way she claimed me as her friend, combined with the obvious pride in her voice, made something warm settle in my chest. Several people approached with questions about pergola construction, and I found myself explaining joint techniques and wood selection with more enthusiasm than I'd expected. "Do you two work together often?" asked a woman who'd been taking detailed notes about Sarah's plant selections. Sarah and I exchanged a look that lasted a beat longer than necessary. "We're exploring some collaborative possibilities," Sarah said diplomatically. As the morning progressed, it became clear that Sarah had found her calling. She moved through the crowd like a natural teacher, offering specific advice tailored to each person's needs while somehow making everyone feel like they'd gained a new friend. The combination of expertise and warmth was exactly what people were looking for in a consultant. "Sarah," said a woman in her 70s who'd been following the entire presentation, "do you do private consultations? My garden is a complete disaster, and I think I need professional help." "Actually," Sarah said, glancing at me, "I'm just starting a consulting business. Would you like my contact information?" The floodgates opened. By the time the last visitor left, Sarah had collected contact information from 16 potential clients and scheduled 3 preliminary consultations for the following week. We collapsed into the patio chairs, surrounded by empty water bottles and the satisfied exhaustion that comes from a successful event. "I can't believe that actually happened," Sarah said, staring at the list of names and phone numbers she'd collected. "People actually want to hire me." "Of course they do," I said. "You just spent 4 hours proving that you know more about plants than most people will learn in a lifetime, and you made it all seem accessible and fun." Sarah looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus, I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened with sudden anxiety. "Okay. When I asked you to come today, it wasn't just about having support for my presentation. I wanted you here because you've become important to me. More important than I was expecting when you first showed up to fix my garden gate." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities and implications that neither of us had been willing to address directly until now. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to know that somewhere between fixing your sprinkler system and watching you teach people about compost, I stopped thinking of you as just a client." Sarah's smile was soft and slightly uncertain. "What do you think of me?" "I think of you as someone I want to keep showing up for," I said honestly. "Someone whose happiness has become important to my own happiness." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the afternoon light filter through the pergola we'd built together. The garden around us buzzed with the satisfied energy of a space that had been appreciated and admired. "I have a confession," Sarah said finally. "That first day, when I gave you my number after you fixed the gate, I'd been rehearsing that line for 3 days. I laughed, genuinely surprised. "You rehearsed it?" "I saw you working out there, and something about the way you approached the repair, methodically, carefully, like you actually cared about doing it right, made me think you might be worth knowing better." "And the comment about romantic days being over?" Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. "I was testing the waters, seeing if you'd run away from a 50-year-old woman who was brave enough to admit she was interested." "I'm not running anywhere," I said, reaching across the space between our chairs to take her hand. "In fact, I'm hoping you'll let me stick around for whatever comes next." Sarah's fingers tightened around mine. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been thinking about what Rebecca said, about us making a good team. She wasn't just talking About construction projects, was she? No, I said. I don't think she was. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the garden that had brought us together. Tomorrow, Sarah would start returning calls from potential clients, beginning the business she'd been dreaming about for months. The pergola would provide shade for future gatherings, and the gate I'd repaired would continue opening and closing as Sarah tended to the space she'd created with such care. "Marcus," Sarah said, our hands still linked, "would you like to stay? For dinner? I was thinking about grilling some of those vegetables we couldn't save from the sprinkler disaster." "I'd love that," I said. "But I should warn you, I'm a terrible cook." "That's okay," Sarah replied with a grin that reminded me of the confidence she'd shown during her presentation. "I'm good enough at it for both of us." As we walked toward the house together, I realized that Sarah had been wrong about her romantic days being over. They weren't over at all. If anything, they were just beginning, growing like the garden around us with patience, care, and the kind of attention that turns possibility into something real and lasting. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said as we reached the back door. 3 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be starting a consulting business and falling for my contractor, I'd have said they were completely delusional. 3 months ago, I was convinced that my life was exactly as complicated as I wanted it to be, I replied. No romantic entanglements, no business partnerships, just me and my toolbox solving other people's problems. Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle. "Do you regret how complicated things have gotten?" I looked around at the garden we'd worked to save, the pergola we'd built together, the space where Sarah had discovered her confidence as a teacher and entrepreneur. "The only thing I regret is that it took me 48 years to find someone worth complicating my life for." Sarah's laugh was bright and genuine. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Give me time," I said. "I'm just getting started." Inside, Sarah's kitchen felt different than it had during our previous dinners together. The space seemed to hum with new possibilities, with the energy of someone who'd just taken a major step toward the life she'd been dreaming about. She moved with purpose, pulling vegetables from the refrigerator and explaining her grilling strategy with the same enthusiasm she'd shown while teaching about soil composition. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was all an elaborate dream," she said, slicing zucchini with practiced efficiency. 16 potential clients, Marcus. 16 people who want to pay me to help them create beautiful outdoor spaces. "It's not a dream," I assured her, leaning against the counter and watching her work. "It's the result of years of knowledge and passion finally finding the right outlet." Sarah set down her knife and turned to face me fully. "I couldn't have done this without you. Not just the practical support, but the confidence. Having someone believe in me made it possible to believe in myself." The honesty of that admission struck me deeply. Sarah had seemed so self-assured from our first meeting that I'd never considered how much courage it must have taken to put herself forward as an expert, to risk professional rejection in pursuit of a dream. "For what it's worth," I said, "I think you would have gotten here eventually, with or without me. You're too talented and too determined to stay hidden forever." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but it would have taken much longer, and it wouldn't have been nearly as enjoyable." We carried our dinner to the patio, where the pergola cast evening shadows across the table. The garden around us had settled into its nighttime rhythm, with the subtle sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked as we began eating. "With the business, I mean, and with us." I reached across the table and took her hand again. "With us, I think we keep doing what we've been doing. Show up for each other, work on projects together when it makes sense, see where this goes without putting too much pressure on it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds wonderfully sensible and completely terrifying." "The best things usually are both," I said. As the evening deepened, we talked about practical matters. Sarah's schedule for the coming week, the fence replacement project we still needed to complete, my own upcoming jobs and how they might fit around her consultation appointments. But underneath the logistics was a sense of anticipation, of two people who'd found something unexpected and were eager to explore where it might lead. "Marcus," Sarah said as we were clearing the dinner dishes, "there's something else I want to tell you. I'm listening." That comment I made about romantic days being over, it wasn't entirely calculated. Part of me really believed it. I'd convinced myself that at 50, The best I could hope for was friendship and maybe companionship. The idea that someone might see me as genuinely romantic seemed like something from my past, not my future. I set down the plates I'd been carrying and turned to give her my full attention. And now, I feel like I'm 25 again, but with better judgment and more realistic expectations, Sarah said with a self-deprecating laugh. It's simultaneously wonderful and absolutely mortifying. There's nothing mortifying about hope, I said, or about being brave enough to act on it. Sarah's smile was soft and grateful. Thank you for making it safe to hope again. As I prepared to leave that evening, we stood by the garden gate that had started everything. The latch engaged perfectly, the result holding firm under gentle pressure, a small symbol of problems solved and systems working as they should. You know, Sarah said, running her fingers along the gate's smooth edge. I almost called a different contractor that day. Thompson Home Services was the third number I dialed. The first two were busy. Lucky for me they were, I said, imagining how different everything would have been if she'd reached someone else first. Lucky for both of us, Sarah corrected. Though, I'm starting to think it wasn't really luck at all. Maybe some things are just meant to happen when you're finally ready for them. I thought about the timing of everything. How I'd been questioning my isolated lifestyle just before meeting Sarah. How she'd been contemplating major life changes right when I appeared to fix her gate. The synchronicity was either a remarkable coincidence or something more purposeful. My grandmother used to say that the universe has a way of putting the right people in your path at exactly the right moment, I said. I never believed her until now. Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the porch lights. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She also used to say that the best love stories start with friendship and grow into something deeper over time. That instant attraction might make for good movies, but lasting relationships are built on shared values and mutual respect. Is that what we're building? Sarah asked, stepping closer. A love story? The question hung between us, bold and vulnerable. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the courage it had taken to ask something so direct. I hope so, I said honestly. I know it's early and we're both being careful, but Sarah, what I feel for you isn't just friendship anymore. It hasn't been for weeks. Sarah's breath caught slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. Because I've been trying to convince myself that what I'm feeling is just gratitude, or companionship, or relief at not being alone anymore. But it's more than that, isn't it? Much more, I confirmed, reaching up to touch her face gently. You've changed everything for me, Sarah. The way I think about work, about community, about what I want my life to look like. I can't imagine going back to the way things were before I met you. Then don't, Sarah said, leaning into my touch. Don't go back. Stay here with me, and let's see what we can build together. The invitation was simple but profound. Stay. Build something together. Create a life that neither of us could have imagined separately. There's something I need to tell you, I said, my heart racing with the weight of what I was about to admit. I think I'm falling in love with you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. Marcus Thompson, I think I fell in love with you the day you saved my tomato plants. I've just been too scared to admit it, even to myself. The confession hung in the air between us, transformative and slightly overwhelming. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, moved from careful friendship into territory that was both thrilling and terrifying. So what now? I asked, though I was already stepping closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of her presence. Now we stop being so careful, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Now we trust that what we've built is strong enough to handle whatever comes next. I kissed her then, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. The kiss tasted like wine and possibility, like the promise of summer evenings and shared dreams. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard, eyes bright with surprise and desire. I should probably go, I said, though I made no move to leave. You should, Sarah agreed, though her hands remained on my shoulders. But maybe you could come back tomorrow. If you want to. I'm making my first business calls in the morning, and I could use some moral support. I'll bring coffee, I promised. The good stuff from David's booth. Perfect, Sarah said, her smile soft and certain. It's a date. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, I couldn't stop smiling. The evening had transformed everything. Our friendship, our business partnership, our carefully maintained boundaries. Sarah Montgomery had gone from client to friend to something much more precious in the space of a few weeks, and I found myself grateful for every moment that had led us to this point. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Sarah's first consultation, calls, the continuing work on her fence project, the delicate process of navigating a relationship that had grown from professional to personal. But tonight, I was simply happy to be driving home from the house of a woman who loved me, who'd chosen to trust me with her heart and her dreams. The garden gate stood perfectly aligned in the evening light, opening onto whatever came next, and, for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited to find out what that might be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.